This episode was made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 123 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Philip K. Dick's 1956 short story and Steven Spielberg's 2002 film, Minority Report. So James, here we are back in the world of Philip K. Dick for the first time, I think, since Blade Runner and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. We read this short story. I assume for you it was the first time. It definitely was for me. And then we revisited a film that I think both of us have seen before. What was your experience like?
It's interesting because I don't think that I ever thought of Minority Report in along the same lines as Blade Runner. But this time with the connection to Philip K. Dick and reading the short story specifically made me realize just how similar these stories can be and are.
Yeah, definitely sort of the crime element, right? Like the detective, it's almost hard-boiled in a sense. It reminded me a little bit of Rick Deckard, for sure. And yeah, I agree. I even felt like there was like some homages to Blade Runner, or maybe I was just picking up on that. But it felt like Spielberg was sort of aware that this was at least associated with Blade Runner, or could be.
Just a couple of things. The emphasis on the eyes was huge in this. So like that's a massive connection there. And you know, the original stories are from the same source. So it is interesting though, because I think when Spielberg kind of put his own spin on it and changed things, it took it away from being as similar to Blade Runner as it could have been. And I actually read that when this movie was in pre-production, when they were starting to develop this movie, they were wanting it to be a sequel to Total Recall, which also was Philip K. Dick, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
That's like kind of where this story began for the movie, and then it just developed over time. And Steven Spielberg eventually got his hands on it, and then it changed dramatically.
I'm really curious about the production that went into this movie, and I do want to talk about it because I think, in many ways, I really like this movie. I really enjoy it, and I really actually love this movie. And then in other ways, I'm frustrated with it. And I kind of want to get into like the reasons that I think there are things that are holding it back. And I'm excited to get into those. But before we do, I want to give this short story its due because I'd never read it before. Read it for the first time here. And what about you? Have you ever read anything from Philip K. Dick back in the 1956 area?
Just one. and like I constantly do think about how Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is such a sick title for a novel or like a short story, whatever that was.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but it's cool for sure.
It's very cool.
And it was written later. I think that was in the 60s. So this was earlier. This was earlier on in his career. I think towards the very beginning of it, when he was still, I think, mostly doing short fiction. He won the Hugo Award for Man in High Castle, which is another adaptation that's doing pretty well right now. From I understand, I've never actually seen any of the show, but I think he won the Hugo for that in the 60s as well, like 63, if I'm pulling that date off the top of my head right. So this was before that, and it feels to me like he was still sort of cutting his teeth and finding his way with the writing. I think in general, after reading, now I've only read two things, right? Like all of Do Androids Dream and then this short story, but I'm finding that I have mixed feelings about his writing. I totally respect that he was brilliant in his ideas, and I think you look at the meat of the ideas that he's putting into these sci-fi stories, and they're so rich, and there's so much to draw on. I think and that's why there's so many Philip K. Dick adaptations that it makes sense. But he also, I don't know if it was maybe because he was trying to write in that sort of hard-boiled mode, maybe being affected by other writers at the time. Because I know in the 50s, I think that hard-boiled detective fiction was very popular. But that style of writing to me feels very sparse, and I often would struggle to feel fully involved in the scenes and like feel like I could really picture everything that was going on. And then I also would struggle to connect emotionally with our main character and some of the other characters around him. So those two things combined can make it kind of a difficult read. And I remember having a little bit of that with Do Androids Dream, but I think I found a way into that character that I never really felt with Anderton here, with John Anderton. I the whole time I felt a little bit removed from him in a way that was keeping me from fully enjoying the story.
Big picture, I think he has some of the most interesting setups for these sci-fi stories, and then just the execution, like the actual like nitty gritty dialogue and like the goings on isn't really that engaging. Like you said, it doesn't really like live up to what the potential of the story could have been. Mm-hmm. And I definitely felt that with the short story, and I think maybe that's part of why some things were changed. Spielberg changed some things in the movie, and I'll be interested to hear if you think there were improvements or just kind of a wash, or how you felt on them.
Yeah, regardless, before we get into the actual film, I was really thinking about like how this story was very ripe for an adaptation, because it had such great ideas, and because it felt like there was a lot of building blocks here that maybe hadn't fully been played with and hadn't fully been explored. So I love the idea of taking a short story and adapting it to a full-length film and really diving into a lot more than you get in the story, and getting into more of the morality and the ethics of the situation, and even some of the philosophy behind it. It just felt like there was so much there that in the short story I was kind of amazed. I'm like, really? They're not gonna engage with this kind of stuff. They're just gonna kind of gloss over it. And I remember being a bit frustrated with it, and then going like, well, if I was a filmmaker and I was looking for something to adapt, yeah, like this classic piece of sci-fi that has a really interesting idea but feels underdeveloped in some ways, seems like a perfect target, right? Of like, I can take this and do more with it. So in that sense, I think it was a good choice. I don't necessarily agree with everything Spielberg did, or think that it was all a good idea, but I like a lot of what happens in the movie, which we'll have to get to. But yeah, no, thoughts on that?
I don't want to say too much about the movie right off the top, because we're going to talk about the short story here, but I think Spielberg used this as an opportunity to kind of lean into some of the movies that shaped him. Like, I've said on this podcast before that he's clearly a huge student of Hitchcock, and like the sort of mystery elements that are in this mixed with the sci-fi elements. I read that he was really excited to sort of blend those genres and like dive into noir, like basically the roots of a noir story with like the hard-boiled detectives that are kind of morally ambiguous. Like you don't really know where they are, what they're going to do. And that sort of like mysteries on top of mysteries on top of mysteries mixed with this sci-fi element. I think it was really cool. And I think something that just keeps jumping into my head that I want to get out there is, I talked about the eyes a little bit. The moment when he's having the surgery to have his eyes removed and swapped out.
Yeah.
Those sort of clamps that were like pulling his eyes apart.
Yeah.
Was such an homage to Clockwork Orange. Like so clearly, like it was so cool that he did that. And knowing that this was after he finished AI, which Kubrick started, and sort of like, he was friends with Kubrick. He loved Kubrick.
I was unclear of the timeline of that. This came after that, or
after AI? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Actually, this movie was slightly delayed because filming went long on AI, and Tom Cruise had filming go long on Mission Impossible 2. So this got pushed a little bit. It was going to come, originally it was supposed to come out sooner, and like development was supposed to begin on it sooner. Okay,
well, I got a lot of ideas and a lot of opinions about the film, but first let's talk about this short story. I have a 2-paragraph summary I figure I'll read maybe in the 2 parts, and we can sort of get into some of the nitty-gritties of the story.
Let's do it.
So John Anderton is the founder and head of precrime, which stops future crimes from occurring by gathering data from 3 precogs. Humans gifted with precognition, now reduced to caged, quote, idiot savants, as their babble is recorded and collated. The day that a new assistant, Ed Whitwer, joins, Anderton receives a report that he will commit a murder of an army general he does not know, Leopold Kaplan. Anderton confronts Kaplan, who harbors doubts about precrime, and goes on the run with Kaplan's help. Anderton is chased by precrime agents and tries to escape with Lisa, who is also an agent. Okay, so that's the first paragraph. I have two. But let's stop there and talk a little bit about the setup of this and some of the key differences, right?
Do you want to talk about differences from the film already?
Well, I mean, both of us are coming in as film viewers, right? Who, like, I've seen this movie multiple times. And coming in to read this, like, immediately I was like, well, this is different and this is different. So I guess it was at the forefront of my mind. But yeah, I mean, this is a very different John Anderton here. He's, much older, not as, he's not an action movie star like we get in the movie. And he's kind of a tool of the state. There's some really interesting things going on with like authoritarianism and sort of law enforcement and freedom that it feels like almost like it's only scratching the surface of it. Like it's presenting all these things as potential points of contention or things to think about. And I find that to be some of the most fascinating parts. And it's interesting because it feels to me very strongly like John Anderton really believes in this system. And then, of course, it creates this really nice drama when he's the one implicated in a murder that he doesn't believe he's going to commit.
It seems in the source material, maybe Spielberg split the character of John Anderton and kind of created the director above him in the film, where it's like he's sort of what he has to lose basically is the fact that in the source material in the original story, John Anderton is so invested in the pre-crime stuff because he's sort of the creator.
Yeah.
Whereas in the movie he's not, but the director seemingly is so invested in it because he wants it to continue and he wants it to spread nationwide in the movie. So it's kind of like taking his character rather than the principal role of like basically overseeing everything to being like sort of a cog in the machine.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see the John Anderton who is invested to the point that he would, potentially commit a murder in order to get to have like the precog program continue.
Right.
Because it is so successful.
Right. Which is what he ends up doing essentially at the end. Essentially, Spielberg used sort of a common tactic of creating a villain who is sort of a foil. You have this opposite character, and they both want the same thing, but they're going about it different ways, right? And in the film, Anderton, he also believes in pre-crime. You know what I mean? Like he is all for it. But then we realize that there is lines he won't cross in order to have this dream, whereas his opposite is willing to cross those lines and has crossed those lines in the same pursuit. So there's that difference that can create the friction there. But yeah, I mean, in the story, just a few things I want to mention is, for one, the precogs themselves feel so underutilized. And partly it's because I've seen the movie and I know that they're like a big part of the story, but like, I don't know if you want to grant him the subtext of it, like the way they're just so dismissive of them, calling them idiots and just like completely dehumanizing them, and they're just tools, don't think of them as human beings, like all this stuff. And then that never really goes anywhere. That's just kind of how they're treated the whole time.
Yeah, like it wasn't even like it's supposed to be some sort of like, there's not like a subtext to it. There's not like some sort of like comparison being drawn or anything like that. He's basically just...
I'll grant that there could be. It's just he doesn't, like, in his world is very unjust. It's like, how do you feel about pre-crime? Because it continues on and they're still sort of enslaved to the system at the end.
But I think what I mean is that, like, specifically our main character never thinks anything other than the fact that they're trash. So like within the world, they're basically like he's just saying like, this is how it is, and they are idiots and they aren't worthless.
You have to bring that as a reader to the story because there's not really any characters espousing that point of view in the narrative. So I agree with that, and it made it difficult because that was something I was thinking about a lot. And then we have this Whitwer character who kind of does some similar things to the Whitwer we get in the movie. But one of the things that I found sort of, I don't know, just kind of astounding was how quickly Anderton turns on his wife immediately.
Yeah, I know, right? Like that was a really weird relationship.
As soon as Whitwer brings up, like, the thing happens, he's like, well, my wife is behind this. Like,
yeah, like clearly there's some baggage there.
Well, and then I was reminded that Philip K. Dick was married 5 times. And his first couple marriages were very brief. I believe this is during his second marriage, if I'm getting that right. And a lot of them were incredibly messy. Potentially, there was one time where he was accused of trying to kill one of his wives, but then later said that it was like some sort of misunderstanding or something, but he tried to drive off a cliff or something with her in the car. All kinds of crazy stuff. The guy was a mess, and it seems like his relationships are all a mess. So it wouldn't shock me if he had some issues that he was bringing to the table here. Because I just remember there was some stuff like that in Do Androids Dream that was a little weird, and then you're getting that again here, and it's the only two things we've read by him. So I'm starting to see a pattern already of how he's going to treat the women in his stories. Because it feels very much like she's out to get me. Immediately leaps to that, and then it's like she kind of is, not really, but she kind of is. I don't know. She does kind of betray him at that one point. And that's his wife, Lisa, who he does immediately tell about the thing, but then he doesn't trust her, so it was weird. It's like, why are you telling her if you don't trust her? And then she tries to turn him in and all this stuff. Let me go ahead and read the second paragraph here, and then we can just kind of talk about the rest of it. Anderton knows 2 precogs confirm a precrime before it is pursued, but there is often a dissenting minority report from the 3rd precog. However, the prediction of Anderton's murder is supposed to change when Anderton discovers the news, changing the significance of the minority report. Kaplan has manipulated events so that precrime will fall to a re-strengthened army headed by Kaplan. Discovering this, Anderton decides to actually murder Kaplan, thus saving precrime. With Lisa, he accepts his punishment and goes into exile. And that's basically the end. So, yeah, I mean, he goes through a journey. He's got these army guys after him. Kaplan is the general who he's never met, but he meets with. And then he finds out about this minority report, but then there's the revelation that it doesn't actually exist for him. And instead there's 3 different reports, if I remember correctly, that each are like came about at like a different phase. So like there's the initial one showing him murdering him, and then there's a second one where it's reflecting like once he found out this information, he no longer was going to kill him. And then there's a third one that shows him like coming around back to the idea of killing him to save precrime, and sort of all 3 exist.
Right.
Yeah, it was kind of bizarre, and really showed how just uncertain. Although it seems very tied to gaining the information. Like the implication is, if you don't know about this report, like if you don't know you're supposed to commit a murder, then you won't change your mind. Like you can't avoid it. But having the foreknowledge creates the opportunity for you to not commit the crime. Which raises all sorts of ethical quandaries that I felt like the story didn't really deal with, but kind of presented.
We've talked a lot about like free will and determinism on the podcast, especially like within the past year.
Yep.
And the idea that I've kind of always talked about is like, even if you did, we've talked about like, even if you did know your future, it's like sometimes it's not possible to change it, or you wouldn't want to change it, or things would still end up the same way anyway.
Well, that's how some of the fiction we've been discussing.
Right.
That's what it proposes. Yeah.
Whereas here, this idea seems somewhat, I don't know, because I mentioned in our Arrival coverage how like I just feel like if like I knew someone was gonna die or something, and you didn't do anything about it, like the knowledge of knowing that they were going to die might change your mind on it. Like there's something about knowing what's going to happen. This story specifically bringing up the idea that like if you have this report, it's going to change what the options are, the outcome, I thought was actually kind of interesting, and it seemed kind of realistic to me in a way.
Now I'm going to do a terrible job of explaining this, but when I went and listened to Ted Chiang speak, he did a presentation here in Portland, and he talked about time travel.
Ted Chiang, the author of Story of Your Life, the short story that Arrival's based off of, right?
Yes, that's correct. And one of the things he talked about was time travel in pop culture. And I don't know if you really thought about this, but this is a time travel story. And the reason being that anytime you have prophecy, that is information traveling backward through time to you. And essentially that's what's happening with these precogs. So you create paradoxes. Anytime you have backwards time travel, you essentially create paradoxes, like I think almost always. And what you're talking about creates a paradox, because if you are going to commit a crime and then you go back in time and you learn about the information that this crime is going to occur and then it doesn't happen anymore, then it didn't happen, so how did you learn about it? You know what I mean? It creates a paradox. There's no on-ramp to this loop you have now created. It either always has been this way or it always wasn't this way. How do you get onto that? And that's kind of always the issue with time travel like this.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating, and one of his points, and I'm going to not do it justice, was essentially that it reflects how we like to feel as a society and what we value. And Americans in particular really value the idea of free will. And this story backs up the idea of free will, so it feels comforting to our sensibilities. And that's one of the reasons why I think this version of time travel, if you want to call it that, feels sort of right to us, or at least isn't something that's challenging, because it feels intuitive that, yeah, of course I can change my future. That backs up the idea that I am not fated, you know what I mean? That my fate isn't fixed.
Right.
We all want to believe that.
This idea that, like, as humans, like, thinking that we have no sort of free will, or thinking that everything is determined, feels kind of trapped. You feel kind of trapped sometimes. And so like in a story like this, you're like, exactly. You're like, of course I could change my future because X, Y, and Z.
Right. And you know, it's definitely fascinating. And I think all different forms of time travel stories, which I'm going to continue to call this, as long as they're internally consistent with how it works, I think they're valuable because, and they're valid because when you're exploring sci-fi, you get to take the impossible and make it possible and engage with it as if it could happen. And so as long as you're internally consistent, I have no trouble with it. So I actually, one of the things I want to give this story props for is that I didn't have trouble buying into the premise and the execution of it. It seemed internally consistent, and I was able to buy into this narrative. What I think is really interesting is the way that it affects sort of law enforcement and government here, and then the ethical quandary of arresting people for crimes that they haven't committed on the assumption that they will commit them. And then you take that further, and the implication of the short story is that if we were to just share with them, hey, you're going to commit this murder, it would give them an opportunity to change.
Right.
Yet that choice is taken away from them, even though Anderton does get it and is able to possibly change, although he doesn't go through with it, to preserve the system because he wants the system in place. So to me, that gets around to, I think, which is a big question for both of these, and that is like a question that I think we're asking all the time in our society, and it's security versus freedom. Right? Like, how much of my freedom am I willing to give away in order to have security and to feel safe? And this system has lowered the crime rates dramatically, almost to zero. I think it's all felonies, and actually in the short stories. And the trade-off being that maybe some people are being imprisoned for crimes that they wouldn't have committed had you shared that information with them. And John seems to believe that that is something that is worth it, ultimately, to society. And it's kind of scary, though, when you think about it that way, right? And it's the kind of decisions you can see being made. And then I would say that the movie kind of comes down on a different side of that question. Right. So that's one of the fundamental changes, I think, that Spielberg made, and how he felt about the idea of precrime and what ends up happening at the end of the movie. So yeah, what did you think about for the story and sort of the built, like the maintaining of the system? Was that supposed to be, in your opinion, like we were supposed to be like thinking that was right and that feeling like the right thing happened, the just thing happened, or were we supposed to be worried about it?
Yeah, I think the story is one of paranoia. Like, I think he wrote this story wanting to raise these sort of red flags for people. I think that the ending reflects this idea that, like, if it gets too far or too out of hand or whatever, there's no going back. You know what I mean? Like, once you've given up a certain amount of freedom, like you're not going to be able to gain that back in any sort of way. So seeing the story end like this and like having the system continue, I think is meant to have you think about what you're giving up, or like the freedoms that you give up in order to feel safer. It makes me think of like if you have like a Ring doorbell, like that's your front door. Every time you walk through, there's a camera, And there have been cases where these are getting hacked. So it's like, that's like the safety around your house is being given at the cost of every time you walk through your front door, there's a potential that someone's hacked it, or
privacy. What you're talking
privacy.
About. Yeah, you're trading security for privacy at that point, which is definitely a trade-off we're making all the time.
Exactly. And I think that is at the heart. I think he was very ahead of his time in thinking like this, and maybe, paranoia of the time was part of the reason why he wrote this story. But I think I think as the author, he comes down saying, this is bad. Anderton had all this stuff happen to him, and then ultimately still commits the crime to keep the status quo and to have everything remain the same, while everyone else who's being affected by it doesn't really understand that like all of these struggles went on, and there's all these loopholes that people can potentially, the Minority Reports aren't common knowledge. So everybody else who's being like all these people who are being policed by this system have no sort of knowledge that there's any other way. And I think it's just his way of having people think more critically about that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that is a generous way to read this story, and one I tend to agree with. I haven't, like I said, I haven't read a ton of Philip K. Dick, and I know that he is known for sort of these big society-wide questions about technology and how it could intersect with day-to-day life. So I tend to read it that way as well. But we have got to move into this movie if we're going to have time to talk about it. So if you're ready to take it away, I want to hear about this film, how it came to be, and if any little details you have about it, and I'd love to hear.
So you mentioned how you thought that the movie, and Spielberg specifically with this movie, came down a little differently on sort of like the messages behind it. And I found a quote that I wanted to read, that it was Spielberg talking about his ideas of the film's technology. And he said this to Roger Ebert before the movie was released. He said, "I wanted all the toys to come true someday. I want there to be a transportation system that doesn't emit toxins into the atmosphere, and a newspaper that updates itself. The internet is watching us now if they want to. They can see what sites you visit. In the future, television will be watching us and customizing itself to what it knows about us. The thrilling thing is that will make us feel we're part of the medium. The scary thing is we'll lose our right to privacy. An ad will appear in the air around us, talking directly to us."
Yeah, and that's come to pass. You know what I mean? Like,
and this is 2002, 2001, 2002. So
it was starting to happen, I think, in that time, but it is hugely prevalent now.
Yeah, and we were talking about the privacy that we've given up at this point, and I just constantly think about like Alexa's in your home, and just so you can turn the lights on and off.
Convenience.
And like, it's just convenience mixed with like the sort of feeling of safety, and I think this movie brings up a lot of that. And I wonder if the maybe the gripes you have, I wonder if Spielberg was aware that people would feel that way, but in service of the story and to kind of do right by the story, I wonder what parts he fabricated in order to tell a certain narrative, not necessarily one that people would agree with. But I wanted to mention just a little bit of stuff here and there. Of course, John Williams is back to score a Steven Spielberg film. This isn't the first time that he's scored a Spielberg film, or the first time we've covered Spielberg, so I won't talk too much about him, but I think there were some stylistic decisions that were made with this movie that are interesting to talk about. There's a lot of world building that went on that wasn't necessarily in the short story, that they had to kind of flesh out the world with. Famously, the sort of three-dimensional, like conducting an orchestra, sort of the way that he manipulates space with the precogs visions and everything like that is pretty iconic for this movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I love John Williams and I think he does great work, but I don't think this is a film where the score particularly stood out to me as being particularly memorable.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's moments that I think are good, but I agree that it's not something I'm humming or anything. Yeah,
it doesn't have like a hook that it feels like, oh, that's very Minority Report. Like, there's nothing like that. I don't know. Maybe I just need to listen to it on its own, but it kind of blended into the background for the most part for me.
I think there's some, maybe it's also John Williams saying like, I want something to be very subtle that will, subliminally give people messages to have how to feel during the movie, but isn't going to be something that's so grand and they walk away singing or anything like that, because maybe it doesn't feel like that kind of movie.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, so I mentioned style-wise. This movie, I'll ask you first. Like, what did you notice in this movie style-wise, as far as like how it's shot?
Feels like the colors are very desaturated. And then it feels like the white levels are very elevated, so much to where like certain scenes, especially I'm thinking like when they're outside, or in like alleyways and stuff, often it would get I was washed out. It would be hard to like see anything in a way that I actually felt was kind of detrimental, but felt very much like some sort of stylized choice to evoke something. That was something I was a little frustrated with. I didn't hate it throughout, and sometimes I thought it worked fine, but it maybe was a little too much. Like they needed to dial it back a little, in my opinion.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think that there were decisions that were made for specific reasons. In this case, you're correct in saying that like intentionally they washed out some of the whites are very
exposed, right?
Overexposed, and there's a lot of sharpness to the light too. Like like it almost like hurts your eyes sometimes to look at it, and it just doesn't feel natural. And I think that that's part of it, is like not feeling natural. Making it feel like abnormal. And I think there's also something about the fact that like this is very clearly a neo-noir story. Like this is like post World War II noir, like all that stuff that went on with noir back in the 30s and 40s or I guess 20s, 30s, 40s. That was such a huge movement for film and like a detective story. Like you cannot make a detective story that isn't influenced by film noir at this point.
So is this like their way of not making it black and white, but kind of evoking a black and white feel?
Well, so contrast is very important in film noir, right? Like the contrast between the darks and the lights, and this sort of like the way, people typically think it's very shadowy. Noir is very shadowy. And I wonder if this was a way to make it like anti-shadowy. Like the opposite of shadowy would be like very overexposed, very light. But also sort of having this same like ambiguous characters and morally ambiguous characters and having a lot of the hallmarks. And there is like, in sci-fi, certain sci-fi, there's like your gritty sci-fi, but there's also like the sci-fi that is well lit. There's something futuristic feeling sometimes about like a very well lit room or something maybe like surgical or something like that. And I think like that all together kind of makes me think those were the the decisions that were being made. But I also heard that there was a certain technique that was used on the film, because this was shot on film. And this was a time when digital was really taking off. A lot of people were shooting early digital films. They overlit these shots and then desaturated the colors, as we talked about. But then in order to do that, they bleached the film's negatives to sort of add that extra texture. So like once the film was shot, they took the negatives and then bleached them, and that sort of gave more gray and more, as you talked about, like there's not a ton of color in this movie, and if it is, it's like blues and grays and whites and things like that. So they treated the film, which I always think is interesting, and it's such a bold decision to just be like, this thing that I shot that looks great, we're gonna do this with it and like treat it in a way. And
I wonder if there was any consideration for, because it felt to me like they were able to mask some of their effects, their like VFX with it. Because like,
I'm sure, yeah. Anytime
like
you can,
when they're outside and they're flying around on jetpacks and stuff, I was like, oh, it's probably really easy to hide the guide wires when you have all this stuff going on in the frame, and just like, I don't know, things were a little muddled at times of high action, and it felt like it would probably be easier to make certain effects work better.
That could be the case, and maybe that was part of the decision. But just something else I wanted to mention is that I think it's an interesting choice. I think it gives it its own unique look. But at the same time, I think it makes it so that when you look at it now as a modern viewer, it kind of makes it like there's something about it makes it feel so abnormal that it doesn't necessarily seem like it was well shot necessarily, or that it looks good. Like it kind of doesn't look great.
Yeah, I'm not going back to this movie and going, oh my God, look how beautiful this movie is. You know, it's because it's not, and that's kind of a shame. And it felt like they were trying to do their own version of like a Blade Runner. But you go back and look at the original Blade Runner, and it looks way better than this movie, in my opinion.
And unfortunately, like I know the decision was made, but unfortunately, like color, people just like color. Like color is interesting to look at, and so like the neons in Blade Runner mixed with contrasting this sort of like dark streets that are always wet because it's raining, and like that's just, I don't know. There's something that like going back to watch that, you're just like, holy shit, this world is something about the world feels more real in some way.
It's really interesting that you say that they bleached the film, because it feels like that's a descriptor I might use to describe how it looks. It looks bleached. So let's move on though, because I don't want to harp too much on just the look of it.
Well, let's talk about the world in general, like the world building that went on, the sort of inventions and things like that. Because there was talk of like flying police and some of those things in the short story, but like all this world that they created. I think there's a lot of hard work put into it, and I think a lot of the visuals are cool and interesting, but something about it doesn't like stick in my mind, like as you mentioned, like a Blade Runner, like so the sort of like the flying cars in Blade Runner, the giant like billboards that are moving and all that kind of stuff. There are just things that I look at and I think like, oh, that's Blade Runner. Whereas when I look at this could be like, oh, is that iRobot? Is that some other like science fiction, slightly futuristic movie?
I can see that. I do feel like the sort of, orchestral touch screen that isn't a touch screen. He's got the gloves on. Like that's something I always remember about this movie. Like one of the first thing that pops into my head when I think about Minority Report is him standing in front of that screen doing all the hand motions. And then the pool where they keep the precogs. And the look of that, the sort of symmetry of that, the way they call it the temple, and it's sort of shot in a way to sort of evoke, I think, sort of a like divinity.
Holy,
that really works. And then there's a couple other bits of tech, like I remember the street scenes being cool and the way that the cars look. For the most part, I really liked that. There are times where it got a little bleached out, but I remember thinking like it's cool how they all these cars appear to be self-driving, and I was thinking like, yeah, that's the way. If we're ever going to have flying cars that look anything like this sort of thing, they're going to have to be fully autonomous for safety, because you just don't want people out there flying a massive vehicle. 16-year-old with their driver's license. So there are limitations, and I think having them being fully automated, like they mostly appeared to be here, is a way to get around it. And so I thought that was cool. It was funny how they had all this tech, but then they would do these funny things like he would say like, "Oh, bring me that over here," and he'd tell the guy, and he'd have to like physically remove like a stick of glass with an image on it, walk it over to the machine, and slide it in to get it to him. And I just thought that was so funny. Little things like that felt very old-fashioned. But I did love like the VR cafe thing that they go to later. I thought was really cool. There's just a lot of fun tech stuff going on here, and I do have to give them props, but I know it's 2002, so it's like some of this stuff was starting to happen, but it felt prescient in a lot of ways, and that's always cool in a sci-fi story. And it's you kind of can fact check them 20 years down the road and go like, how much of this came true? And it's of course not everything's going to be right, or they'll have things wrong. Like the newspaper is funny. Like, of course we're not going to have a newspaper because we all have phones now. But they didn't realize how prevalent smartphones were going to be in 2002, which was like kind of the dawn of the iPhone starting to come out right around that time. So maybe should have foreseen it. But like if you look at an iPhone as like a moving newspaper, it kind of is that. But it was funny to see a man holding a newspaper with like digital ads on it and stuff. It was like, okay.
Well, it's just, Harry Potter. They were like, oh, Harry Potter, right? Like the moving pictures and everything.
Yeah.
Couple of scenes that I definitely want to talk about. So the opening scene of this movie is I would say amazing. It's so cool. It's a snapshot of what the movie is going to be.
Yep. Tells you everything you need to know about the way that it works.
And the best part about it is it doesn't necessarily tell everything, is that it's showing, which I talk about constantly on this podcast, is like we're seeing him see the crime. We're seeing the balls be created, and we're seeing like, oh, this person is going to kill this person. Yeah. And then it's a rush, and we see the time, how much time he has left until it happens.
Brilliant idea to make it a crime of passion, something that still occurs. And and I love the idea, because it's really clever in a way, of having it be like, it comes up fast and you have very little time to prevent it from happening. Which, if you think about it, if prophecy is real, that shouldn't matter.
Right.
But the implication that it does already to me implies that this system is fallible, which is important because we learned that it is. Right.
Right. Well, it's because there's no time to think. Like you have to react.
Right.
No matter what news you get, like there's no time
and it shows that there's a malleability to our futures. Because if our futures are immalleable, then you could know that someone was going to murder someone 20 years from now, even if it was a crime of passion, because it was always going to happen. But by saying that they only know about it 20 minutes beforehand shows that there is some level of mutability there that immediately throws the whole system into question.
So the precogs, let's talk about the precogs a little bit. There is something interesting that I read that I wanted to talk about. Did you know that the precogs in this story, in this movie, had the names changed because each of them represents a famous mystery writer?
Right, I did read that. Do you want to share them with me?
Dashiell Hammett.
Yep, I've heard of them. Yeah.
And then of course Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie.
So yeah, you got Agatha, Arthur, and Dash, I think they say. So yeah,
Dashiell. Yeah.
And they don't lay that out in the movie, so you just have to have read about that later, or make that jump of that connection. But I think it's cool.
It is very cool.
Little shout out to
again, and I think it's Spielberg. Like I think there's a ton of homage in this movie to mystery, to sci-fi, to filmmakers, to writers. I think it's very cool.
So I know we have a lot of scenes we want to talk about, but should I get into sort of my overall criticisms of this movie?
Go for it, yeah.
To me, it felt like this movie didn't know what kind of movie it was or what kind of movie it wanted to be. And so it tonally felt inconsistent to me. Part of it, and I'm not saying that my criticisms, if implemented, would have made this movie sell more or be more of a blockbuster. But it might have made it better, at least in my opinion. Better in a purely qualitative sense. And that to me was that it felt like there were times where Spielberg leaned heavily into his I guess I'm kind of making an Indiana Jones type movie, so I'm going to put in a big Indiana Jones sequence now. And one of the key examples of this, a sequence that I think could entirely be removed,
is the car.
And I don't think the movie would suffer from it, is the battle in the car factory.
Yeah.
It's very Indiana Jones. It's kind of silly. You literally have Witwer and Anderton getting into this silly fist fight while they're on top of a swinging crane thing and falling into a car as it's being put together. And there's a few of these moments. Some work better than others, but it felt very much like we got to have really cool high action stuff for the trailers to get people to come see this in the theaters because we want this to be a big blockbuster action movie. Whereas I think this movie is only an action movie on the surface and really is much more of a cerebral sci-fi thriller with a mystery at the heart. And those elements are what this movie really is. And so it felt frustrating to me at times when it would get into this action movie stuff a little much. And it would feel self-indulgent in a way, and it would feel like it curated in a way that made me think they thought, we want to make this movie, make a bunch of money, and here's a way we can make it happen.
I do think that some of the fight scenes were cool, but I agree with you because I think they were I think most of them should have been a lot shorter.
Yeah.
I think most of them should have been a skirmish or something like that, but it turned into extended sequences like you're talking about. But I actually drew a similarity to. I felt like this movie, when it's at its best, is kind of leaning into the memento of it all. It felt a lot at times, there were moments that felt like Memento, where a mystery was on top of a mystery on top of a mystery. Yeah. And when you think you figured it out, they pulled the rug out from under you to reveal another thing that's a monkey wrench in the whole thing that changes your opinion on where things are going. And I think my prime example of that is when Witwer confronts the director. Is one of the moments where you're Witwer has some information, he's confronting the director in that scene right before he's killed by the director. And then the other one is when Anderton commits the crime anyway, but it's because the guy pulled the trigger, and so everyone thinks he killed him. Mm-hmm. So the crime technically still took place in the eyes of everyone else, but it really didn't in the eyes of us because we saw our main character not actually do it. Yeah. So those are the two moments where it's I think
that's when it's at its best.
It's another layer being pulled back, and revealing another mystery.
And that's what the movie is, I think, at its heart. And it's frustrating because I think about these other great sci-fi films that people beloved, like Blade Runner and others, and you just don't hear people also say, "Yeah, and Minority Report is right there," Yeah. And I think part of that is that it doesn't quite realize what kind of movie it has the potential to be. And it really needs to lean into all that stuff. And what we don't need is sequences of Anderton sort of there's a part where he runs up the side of a pillar and does a backflip onto the shoulders of the man who was holding him, and then leaps off of his shoulders up onto something. And it's like, wait, he's a fucking ninja now? Like,
oh, that sequence, by the way, with the jetpacks was another one where I was just, it went on way too long, and it was kind of,
some of that was cool, some of it was not cool. Yeah, and like I'm a fan of the spider sequence. Like, that's cool. Him hiding from the tech.
I want to talk about that scene for sure.
I think that's really good. So yeah, it's not all the moments, and even some of the car chase stuff was pretty fun. But then that brings me to another thing that kept rearing its head, and that was these like odd moments of humor that felt like the filmmaker maybe not trusting the audience to buy into sort of a bleak world. And so it kept trying to inject humor in ways that felt really weird and sort of like I was saying, tonally inconsistent. So one example is when he leaps off the car and he flies to the like garden. He's in this like yoga studio, and a woman comes walking up to him in like a yoga pose. And then later, with some of the stuff that goes on with like the plants and the woman when he's talking to her, and she's behaving sort of strangely. You have a lot of the stuff that goes on with the doctor later, and the gags that they keep pulling around things being dirty and the rotted food, and I don't know. It's just like these weird bits of humor that kept getting injected into the movie that didn't always work.
Yeah, I thought that the character that was running the sort of pleasure factory or whatever that thing was called, what was that? Like
Are you talking about like the VR cafe thing?
Yeah, the cafe thing. That character as a whole was just really there for the jokes, you know. But in a movie that didn't necessarily need it.
But I don't know. I kind of liked him though.
Did you?
Weirdly, I kind of liked him because like I don't know. It felt like he felt like a real person. He just was like kind of crazy.
You're saying like someone who would run that cafe would act like that kind of thing?
He could be like that. And I loved the way that he reacted to the precog being there. And how he immediately was like crossing his heart and like telling her, he's like, I didn't do those things you think I'm going to, or I won't do the things you think I'm going to do. And I didn't do the things that I did. And just like a lot of that stuff was really funny. And that was some humor that I thought worked. But yeah, I don't know. I have other ones noted here. When we first meet the doctor and he's got this big booger in his nose and he's like, oh, it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And I don't know. Just
it's like there's a lot of gross out stuff in this movie, interestingly enough. Let's talk about that scene that you mentioned, though, the spider scene, because I think the choice to like take his eyes away and first of all, the choice to swap out the eyes is an interesting one. And then the whole scene with like the bandage over his head and he's got like the ropes to find his way around. The spiders are on their way in. He's trying to block them and then he gets under the water. And then, he risks opening his eye and eventually he gets it scanned, even though he could go blind, which I think would have been interesting to have him blind in one eye because of the fact that he opened one eye early. Like, I don't know.
And I love the motif of vision, and it feels maybe a little unfocused. But there's definitely a lot about like, the blind man who sells him drugs and the drugs are for clarity. And how scanning your eyes is the way to identify you, and you can change your identity by changing your eyes, and then having the vision of the future is this. It's all about, wanting information and the power of information. I don't know. There's just a lot going on with eyes, and these little spiders. I liked how they like worked in concert with each other, opening grates for each other. There's the shot of like it's like above, and I see this, you see this sometimes in films, but. It can be done effectively in a way that I like, and this is one where
the toy box type thing.
Yeah, you're like looking down into this from overhead, and you see all these different people and engaging with the little spiders.
I love that, and like most of that, like that, and the reason I love it is because it's like a Spielberg Warner. Like he's so famous for these. So he's just rolling on these scenes, and like, they had to build the set and like the blocking and the sort of coordination that needs to go on, and like everybody's getting their eyes scanned and going back to their arguments and that kind of thing. That scene is, I think all in all, that spider scene with the bandage and the Anderson running around blind and trying to figure out what he's gonna do. Tense scene, and I think it's really effective. Probably one of my favorites of the whole movie.
Yeah. I did remember one of the other sort of silly moments, and that was when the jetpack sears a rack of steaks when they're fighting in somebody's house. Those are the kind of moments that were a little bit like, it was like trying to inject the fun action adventure genre of Indiana Jones into this movie that to me just never felt like that fit here. And maybe other people would like totally disagree with me, and that's fine. It's just personally, I wanted like it stole some of the seriousness of the narrative away, and it sort of it felt like at times they were trying to elevate him into this over the top, larger than life action hero, whereas I wanted Anderton to be much more grounded, personally.
Well, is it just, I think that it's not to say that like there shouldn't be humor in serious stories. I think you're just saying there's too much of it and maybe some of it's a little hammy, right?
Well, and those moments were silly. Like there's a different kind of humor. Like the guy in the VR cafe, I don't know, it's like a character-based humor, and it makes sense for this world, whereas the yoga thing and the searing of the steaks and some of that stuff, it was very almost, I don't know if you'd call it slapstick, I don't know if that's the right term, but it just was silly humor, and it would always sort of take me out of it. Like, why do we have this really silly, I don't know, like, can you imagine, in Blade Runner, the final fight against, the android, and then something silly happen like that happen? Like, it would just be weird if like all of a sudden the tone completely shifted for a moment so we could have this laugh at something ridiculous.
Well, so, and like, speaking of the tone of some of the movie, how do you feel about the relationship with like the reason he got into the precog stuff because of what happened to his son, and like I think a lot of that worked, and like this idea of him watching the home movie stuff, and I specifically like his wife's character a lot more in this because there's like a real relationship.
Well,
there
and the son thing didn't happen in the short story. That's fully invented for the movie, and I think it was great.
And I think that works really well, and it's in keeping with Spielberg's sort of like broken home narrative in a lot of his movies.
And having Anderton be this broken down drug addict who is fully bought into the system because he doesn't want it to happen to someone else. And he has this personal stake, and he feels like whenever he's preventing murders, he's like doing justice for his son. They don't come out and say that. They kind of do, but they don't really. But like, that's all there. And I think it all works because it sets him up to be a character who should not turn his back on the system, yet the narrative is designed in a way to make him question. And, I think that works really well. And that's a perfect way to set him up.
All right, so I think there's definitely like one massive thing that we need to talk about. I want to get your take on. There is something that happens in this that kind of gives some ambiguity to the story. And it happens near the end when Anderton is captured. The person who, as he's going away, the person is telling him, as you're being put to sleep in this, it's kind of a rush. They say you have visions, your life flashes before your eyes, that all your dreams come true. And this is like as he's going into the machine that's going to like have him under. And I guess the question is the rest of the movie just him under and in prison still, or is it actually all happening as it happens?
I did not think about that, but you're right. I think those kind of discussions are fun to have. I think they could have been playing with that idea, but I'm less interested in trying to think of the movie that way because it sort of negates everything that happens at the end, and it makes it hard to kind of engage with in a way that I like to. I don't know.
So the movie departs from, because there's kind of this happy tie it with a bow ending in the movie versus the sort of ending that we get in the story. And I just wonder, like, was it, I think it's definitely there to raise questions, whether you want, whichever side you land on. I think the more interesting one is that it plays out as it does, even if it is kind of neat and orderly. But the idea that it could be either or is at least something nice that I think Spielberg had to know that people were going to think that, because it does seem like something that on repeat viewings you would definitely pick up on.
I do like that because there are a few things you could say to back it up. They wake him up and he's at the party already, and it felt like, how long's this party been going on for? How quickly could he get over there? And so there's a little bit of like a dream quality to it in a way that I think like I'm able to, in film you forgive a lot of this stuff because you're like, oh, you assume it's being cut for time or whatever. But if you wanted to say maybe this is all hallucination or a dream he's having, there is something to be said for that could back it up, I guess. That's kind of fun.
Well, I guess, and like the counter argument to it that I saw someone say online was, if that was the case, wouldn't his son in some fashion still have been alive or something ultimately? You know, like, wouldn't he have, as he goes into like a dream where everything comes true for him?
He does have a new baby on the way at the end.
That's true.
So, you know what I mean? Like, his life has been repaired, and he, you know, the last time we see him, he's back with his wife again, and she's pregnant. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, he is sort of refashioning his life. I don't know. That is really interesting because I think there is a lot of stuff that can back it up, but I think we have to kind of set that aside because like that's a whole different way of reading the end of this movie that kind of prevents you from being able to engage with it as face value, which is the reveal of the plot to. It was funny too because it was like, oh, all you have to do is perfectly recreate this crime based off of the vision so that people like it seemed like it was a lot harder than they were making it out to be, but maybe plausible he could do that. I don't know. But yeah, I like it. It was twisty, you know, it was sort of surprising, and I don't know, it was fun. It was fun to see him get his comeuppance and get confronted at the end.
Yeah, I like it. And I think it fits in with what I was talking about before, where like every time you think the mystery has been solved and you know why or how something happened, it's just like the reveal is usually going to throw you for a loop. So what do we think of this idea that like in the polar opposite of the story, precog program has been shut down, all that kind of stuff at the very end here?
Well, and that's, to me, that's Spielberg saying like the system isn't fair. I think it's an ethical quandary, but like if you could predict with 99.9% accuracy that someone was going to murder somebody, and you could prevent that from happening by putting them away, is that 0.1% enough of a percent to say that we should scrap that? Like, it's not worth it. But the 0.1% of convicting someone who wouldn't have actually done it. And what's crazy is like our system is already like that. People get arrested falsely all the time and convicted falsely for all the time for crimes they didn't actually commit. But to some extent, like there has to be a number there, right? Like there has to be, and it's hard to think about, but like we want to think that things are infallible, but like nothing is. So to hold it to that level of it has to be infallible, I don't know, it just seems difficult. I think
but the idea of stopping murder, like the 0.1%, is it worth it? You know, the idea of like murders being over.
Well, that's the utilitarian question. It's like the trolley problem kind of deal. Like, do you throw the switch and you know, save the many, sacrifice the one? Do you let some people go to jail falsely for something they wouldn't have committed just to prevent all the other ones that would have happened?
And it's like if you can prove that there won't be human error, which is another big factor in this, is that it's human error, not the precog. You know, it's because someone took advantage of the system. It's not because of the actual precog stuff that was going on. If like each minority report was looked at on a case by case basis, and then I guess then you're also adding in the human element, but maybe when the minority report comes up, there's investigations done, things like that. But I don't know, there might not be enough time, all kinds of things like that.
And I think the thing that is like the monkey wrench that gets thrown into all of this is that the realization that you have essentially enslaved 3 human beings,
right? Yeah.
In order to do this, and we get that tour guide talking about, oh, they get to have the greatest access to these gyms, and they can, you know, spend time at leisure from the safety and privacy of where, you know what I mean? Like just complete lies about these beings these people who live in a tank. And you know what I mean? Like, and then at the end we see them sort of enjoying life in their cabin. And that is, to me, one of the things that is like a complete deal breaker, is like the idea that you've enslaved people and you're forcing them to witness murders over and over again. And like no amount of saving life seems worth it to me if that's the price you're paying for it. Yeah,
I agree with that. You mentioned the cabin at the end. Apparently, that's a direct homage to Blade Runner. The sort of like the way that the camera like sweeps, like falls away from them as they're like living their life.
I want to shout out Samantha Morton, who we just covered on John Carter, because I think she gives a really great performance here. It maybe is a little much at times, but for the most part, she's really engaging. The way she like will stare off in like a corner of the room or into the distance while something's going on, but then clearly she's reacting to what's going on around her. I thought it was a really powerful way to imply her sort of sight beyond sight that she has, right? Like she is experiencing what's going on, but she's also seeing the future of it, like the immediate future of it. And that character just seemed otherworldly but also vulnerable and I don't know, just really engaging. And I think that performance has to be nailed for this movie to work as well as it does. And I think she did a great job.
You just reminded me of something. There's a shot when they're embraced, Anderton and the precog Agatha. They're like they're like hugging each other, and there's a shot with like I don't know, just the way that it's framed and the way that like the light is coming from either direction and just their faces illuminated. That is like an image of, I feel like maybe it's on one of the movie posters or something of this movie.
I agree. I was about to say, I think it's on a poster, but maybe
I think it's on a poster, but that is a beautiful shot. And like I always think of that shot when I think of, it's that and the hands, like doing the hands that I always think of when I think of.
Well, and there is a wonderful moment that sort of becomes weird, but I think is truly fantastic. And that's when Agatha is explaining to them how she can see the alternate future of their son's life had he lived. Mm-hmm. And when she's like laying that out to them, it's just like devastating them. But also like, it's like that, you can clearly, it's like that happy, sad, and it's cathartic for them. And it's powerful. And then I love that she turns that to say like, that's what my mom wanted, essentially. And we got it. That's why I've been showing this to you. And really this whole thing of like her showing him and asking, do you see, has been all been about her own story, which makes sense. And I just love that moment. I think it's really powerful, well acted. And then we get sort of the weird, moment where she's like, I'm sorry, John, but you're going to have to run. And then he's like, what? And she just goes, rah! And she just like screams it. And it's like she screams it for so long that the cops land, get out of their car, get out of their vehicle, come inside the building, come up to the top floor. And she's like still screaming it. And he's still standing there going like, what do I do? They capture him. And I'm like, why couldn't you have like said something a little sooner? You know what I mean? Like you waited till there was apparently either 30 seconds left, or maybe you just screamed for 2 minutes straight. Like, I don't know. It was kind of weird. Didn't really give him any chance to escape, right? Which, like, after everything that had gone on at the mall, it felt like she could have done that. So then, like, I got to thinking, like, could you read it as her, or, like, maybe she knew he needed to be captured in order for everything to play out the way that it did. So you could maybe see it that way. Like, she's sort of pulling the strings, like, you're going to get captured, and then your wife's going to confront him, and then all this stuff's going to happen, and eventually I'll get justice. And I know that because I can see the future. And, obviously he can't be dreaming if that's true, but I felt like that could be a way of reading the ending here, is that really Agatha is sort of the puppet master pulling all the strings for this and making it all happen.
I mean, yeah, I could see that too. Definitely see that. Do you want to end by talking about Tom Cruise's performance? Do you have anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah, let's talk about Tom Cruise. I mean, he's a weird guy,
I think we've addressed it before with our All You Need Is Kill / Edge of Tomorrow coverage.
Yeah, Edge of Tomorrow coverage. We talk about him, but he's good at certain things, and I think he's a good action movie hero, action movie star. He's got good range, and I think he shows it pretty well here. I think he's solid. I don't think he was underutilized. I think they knew what they had in him and they used him well. And so in that sense, I think this is a good Tom Cruise movie. Colin Farrell, although he's definitely very young here, to me, he's the one where I felt like he was pretty underutilized, but maybe that's just where I've seen him go in the like later movies. It feels like he's capable of so much more than we get from this character. But he plays this sort of like, you're not supposed to like him at all early, and then he kind of turns around by the end and you like him. But like early in the movie, he's chewing gum, he's grinning when he's not supposed to be, he's like barging in and going places he's not supposed to go, he's shitting on everyone's parade, and just, he plays that character pretty well, I guess. But then, yeah, I don't know, it just felt like he didn't have a lot of depth, whereas I think that Colin Farrell is capable of playing characters with a lot more depth than this. But, like I said, early on in his career. So yeah, I don't know. What were your thoughts on Tom Cruise and others?
I agree with the Colin Farrell comment. I think that he's amazing. I think he's a great actor. He's definitely one of those ones that I think he's definitely underrated, I would just say overall. he's had some great performances in some really bizarre and awesome movies. This was one where it was kind of just like a serviceable performance because it was what he was given. Tom Cruise, I think it's just, as much as like I don't agree with the guy, in the real world, I don't, he's kind of a weirdo, crazy person. There's no denying that like he is a movie star, and he's worked with some of the greatest directors of multiple generations. He's continued to keep a really high level of acting, and like he always gives believable performances. He doesn't disappear into roles like somebody like Gary Oldman or someone like that, but he is always believable in the role. You're always like that's Tom Cruise, and he's giving it his all.
He kind of plays himself in a lot of movies, I think you could argue.
Yeah.
He's like an Arnold, or a lot of these iconic action movie heroes. They tend to sort of play a version of themselves in every movie they're in.
But he has shown, like you said before, he's shown range. Like he can do much more than that. But I think typically when people think about him, it's the action star Tom Cruise. Anyway, I thought it was good. Overall, I really enjoyed this movie. It was fun revisiting it for the umpteenth time. It was really cool to read the source material as well. I found it interesting, by the way, that even petty theft seemingly is seen by the precog. So like if you steal a pack of gum, you better watch out because they're gonna fucking get you.
Yeah, and that's in the short story. In the movie, I sort of smartly made it only murder.
Right.
They had kind of a hand-wavy answer as to why, but I liked it okay. And I liked that they were engaging with this idea of the divine too throughout, of like, this isn't just science. This is like, we feel like priests, and they feel like they're these seers in the oldest sense, and the way people treat the precogs as like otherworldly holy beings. I don't know, this thought was really fascinating. So I want to we're going to take our vote, our new thing we're doing this year, where we vote on like which we thought was better, the short story, or the source material, or the adaptation. But before we do that, I want to get your thoughts more on just like this movie as a whole, and like, where does it sit for you? Because I think it's clear to me that this isn't like one of your favorite movies. It sounds like you like it.
Yeah.
If it's not one of your favorite movies, like, what do you think is holding it back?
I mean, things that we've talked about for the most part. I think you were spot on with the sort of tonal indecision. I think that I really feel that like there were very cool components to the world that were memorable, but I felt like the world just didn't feel as lived in as I would have liked. More than that, I think it's also like the movie is very clean, and I think that maybe some more ambiguity to it, and maybe taking it and it does seem like they wanted to go in like a dark and gritty route, but like maybe give it more of this sort of the traditional noir, like on the streets, gritty, like I don't know. I feel like for the most part, you kind of always feel like Anderton's a good guy. And I don't think that the ambiguity was really there as much as, I mean, I think the only reason you really doubt him is because like the prophecy says he's going to kill someone. And in the story, or in the film, even more so, because like you're like, he doesn't kill anybody. He doesn't kill, well, maybe he kills people, but he doesn't kill that person that he was the prophecy. Well, he doesn't kill anyone actually, does he? Because otherwise there would have been precogs.
He never technically kills anyone. The guy kind of kills himself, I guess, is what you're arguing with the pistol thing. Yeah. And then once again, the guy at the end kills himself. So yeah,
it just doesn't go as far as I think it could have in order to make it more of a gut punch. I don't know if they had really leaned into some of these things. I think it could have been better. Yeah,
and I just, to me, I'm always going to remember this movie as something that it was a good adaptation. It had lofty goals. It added a lot to this story that I think worked well. Had some good performances, some really nice ideas. Was kind of ugly in its bleached out look, which at times wasn't bad, but then other times stands out. And then sort of has an identity crisis, in my opinion, like I touched on before. I think it struggles to figure out whether or not it is a high-flying action movie or a, like I said, cerebral sci-fi thriller. And I want more of the latter than the former. So for me, that does hold it back a little bit. It's a movie I really enjoy, and I've seen probably, 6, 7, 8 times now, I think, at this point. I will revisit it in the future. I think it's a fun movie. I think it's got a lot of great ideas. I like that it's sort of meticulously plotted in a way that I think I always impresses me in movies, when it's like clear that they had to make all these things fit just a certain way to make the story work. I love all of that, and so for that reason, I think it's a good movie. But yeah, it keeps it from being like a top tier film for me.
Yeah, I think with that, just roll right in. What's your pick? Are you taking the book in this instance, or are you taking the film?
Well, I'm going to break with my tradition of one episode. I'm going to go with the film here. And as much as I have pointed out some flaws in this movie, I think my experience reading the short story left a lot to be desired. Like I said earlier, I just kind of struggled to really connect with the characters in the short story. I didn't feel like I was experiencing the world. I was impressed with the ideas. I was impressed with the sort of foresight and the big questions that were being raised. But beyond that, I don't know. I'm starting to wonder if I'm maybe just not the biggest Philip K. Dick fan, at least of his actual prose. Because that's kind of what was kind of knocking me out of the story over and over again. I was just finding difficulty sort of getting vested. So yeah, I'm going to go with the movie.
Yeah, I mean, for similar reasons, I'm going with the movie. I think that as much as we've talked about how the movie it still didn't make good on a lot of the things that it could have. I think that they're like with the world and like the promise of what this idea presents. I think the movie did a lot more than even the short story did. So just for that reason, and because as we've talked about, like the short story just, I think it's a great idea and great framework for a story, and then the execution just isn't really there. And I think that's part of why Spielberg running with it and kind of adding some of these things, which I think most of them did work. A lot of the additions I thought did work. So I think I'm going movie this time.
All right, so we're coming down on the side of the movie being better. Officially for this project. Like we said last time, if you didn't hear us, this is something new we're trying this season on the podcast, and really it's not to be definitive in any way, but it's more just to give us something to talk about here at the end of the episode, at the end of our project, and we want to hear from you as well. So please write in inktofilm@gmail.com or comment on our social media posts, and let us know if you agree, disagree, and why. Definitely curious to know your guys' reasoning. If you think that the story's way better, tell us why. I'd be really curious to hear that. And we're going to keep doing that, I think, going forward, at least for, this season, see how it works and see if people like it. So also, if you'd like to give us any feedback on it, we're open ears, for that sort of thing. And make sure to stick around for the very end of the episode, where we're going to talk about our next project for next week. But before that, we want to thank our patrons for supporting this podcast and making this thing possible to continue by financially supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/inktofilm and you'd find out how to become one yourself and see all the bonus content we have available on there.
Yeah, and also connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, active on all of those. And join our Council of Inklings, because we post polls, which decided this project, Minority Report, was decided by a poll in the group. And we also post news. There's the news about the thing sort of that's coming out that we posted pretty quickly after we found out about that.
Remake of John Carpenter's The Thing.
Right, but it's also like kind of not a remake. It's like going to be based on like other like literature, so it's going to be interesting. I mean, fingers crossed it's good, but The Thing is a high bar, so we'll see how that goes.
Yep. Anyway, and if you liked this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever podcast app you use. It's a great way to get the word out for us and get other people to find us. Also, make sure you're subscribed or follow on Spotify or whatever it is. Those numbers tend to factor a lot into whether or not the algorithm decides to show our podcast to other people. So whatever platform you use, make sure you're subscribed.
Thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, man. So let's talk about next week's project. We are going to be covering Water for Elephants by Sarah Gruen, and we're excited to get into it. It's a book I've never read. It's a movie I've never seen. So I'm going in blind, and it was commissioned by one of our patrons. So, hopefully you guys check it out. It's going to be our sort of Valentine's project, too. I hear that there's maybe some romance going on, so hopefully that'll feel appropriate.
Yeah, I haven't read the book, and honestly, I'm so unfamiliar with it, even though I think I caught like a portion of it on HBO at some point, and like don't really remember it very well. So I am interested. I'm happy that someone commissioned it, because I feel like it's one of those things that I probably wouldn't have, revisited without this. So it's
and that's
a great
a beauty
reason.
That's the beauty of these commissions, right? Like they often are having us cover things that we wouldn't have chosen on our own. Because either they're on our radar, or it's just something that we didn't know people were interested in, or what have you. But usually it's a great experience. Thinking back about like Enemy Mine was a movie I would have never watched. You know what I mean? A book I would have never read if someone hadn't commissioned it. So yeah, if you want to find out how to do that, definitely check out our Patreon. You can find out how it was done. But I'm excited about it. Hopefully you guys join us next week when we talk about Water for Elephants, the novel, and then the following week when we talk about the movie. But until next time,
thanks for listening.